Hey, happy Friday. Welcome back to another Friday Tech Workshop. I'm Joseph, a senior developer advocate with Appsmith, and this week we're going to check out the new Appsmith Workflows that's in public beta. Now, Appsmith Workflows are code-based instead of node-based, which makes it much easier to manage complex workflows at scale. You can trigger an Appsmith workflow from another Appsmith app, from a webhook, or from a scheduled cron job. Today, we'll take a closer look at the webhook trigger option and automate adding contacts to HubSpot whenever a new customer is added in Stripe. First, we'll enable a new webhook in Stripe and send that subscription to an Appsmith workflow. And then once that workflow is listening to the data, we can transform it to the proper format for HubSpot and then send it off to create a new contact. So let's get started. First, we'll create a new workflow and enable the webhook trigger. All right, let's check it out. All right, so I've got my list of customers here in Stripe, and we want to set up a webhook so that each time a new customer is added, it will create a contact in HubSpot. So we've got two different tables, two different SaaS platforms here. They use different names. One's calling it a customer, the other one's contact, and the individual field names are a little different as well. So we'll have to transform the data, set up that webhook subscription so that the data coming from Stripe is in the right format when we send it to HubSpot. And then we'll be able to automate that flow so that all the new customers in Stripe become a contact in HubSpot. So first, what we'll do is create a new workflow. So from the main apps page here, you can create apps or workflows and packages. So I'm going to create a new workflow in this workspace, and we'll just rename this Stripe to HubSpot. All right, now this is the code that will execute whenever the workflow gets triggered. And you're going to pass in some type of data and then do something with that data. You can write your own custom logic here. I'm just going to console.log the data. And we'll run this, and then you'll see that it asks for some input data down here. So when you're testing it in the editor, you can pass in some sample data, and we'll just say test is equal to 1, 2, 3. And so this is going to take some type of data coming in. We run it, and you'll see that the execution has started. And then we see that console log of the data that we passed in, and then the workflow has completed successfully. So somewhere in your code, you should have a return true for the expected case if everything works right. And then you can also have some type of check where you're going to return false if, say, the data is missing. So let's say we're expecting a customer ID in this data. I'm going to say that if there's no customer ID, we want to return false. So what we'll do here is check, say, if there is no data.customer ID. And then we'll go ahead and run this again. And I'm just going to leave this like it is without a customer ID. And so you can see that the execution completed. It's not an error because we are telling it to return false. So as long as you're doing that check, it completes the workflow, but it doesn't go in the direction of the success where you'd actually edit some data and do something with it. So we didn't get that log. I'm just going to add a second console log to go with this branch. And we'll just say no customer ID. Run this one more time so we can tell for sure which branch of the logic was ran here. So you can see that if we pass in some data with a customer ID, then we should get that console log here and return true. All right, there it is. So we have a workflow that is expecting some data with a customer ID. And as long as that ID is in there, then we can write some logic here and do something with that. So I'm going to go ahead and publish this workflow, deploy it so that we can actually access it from outside of the workflow editor. So here's where you can edit and test it. But if you want to trigger it from anywhere else, from another Appsmith app, from a webhook or a cron job, you'll have to deploy it to have that version of the code actually live and accessible and be able to trigger it from somewhere else. So the next thing that we'll do here is go to the settings, and you can enable the webhook trigger here. And this is going to give you a URL with a API key as a URL parameter. So I'm going to copy this, and I'm just going to leave this open for a minute because we won't get this value again. You can disable the webhook and turn it back on or regenerate it if you need a new key, if you lose this one. But you'll only be able to access this copy that one time. So you can copy the URL itself here, or the entire curl request, which will create a post and put that data in the body. So I've got that value copied. Now the next thing that we'll do is go over to Stripe and enable a webhook that gets triggered every time we add a new customer, and then we'll send that data to this webhook. So I'm going to leave this page open. We'll head over to Stripe. You want to make sure you are in test mode. Make sure this is on and that you see the red or orange banner up here. So then we'll go and enable the webhook itself. You go to the settings, and let's see, where did I find this last time? Right, we got to go to the developer section first, and then event destinations. So from here, you can add a new endpoint. And so we'll paste in that URL from Appsmith, and you can see that it's putting that API key on the end here. So make sure that you're using the value that is just the URL and not the whole curl request. And then choose which events you want to monitor. So under select events here, I'm going to the customer section, expand that, and I'm only going to get the customer created. Now, if you wanted, you could do customer update as well, and then have a different part of your webhook, your Appsmith workflow that looks at updates and finds a matching record in HubSpot and update the existing one. So if you want it to fully sync, you can do all that. Today, we're going to keep it simple and only focus on the customer. Today, we're going to keep it simple and only focus on creating a customer. So I'm going to go ahead and add this event. And so we'll create the endpoint for this URL for that one event of a customer being created. And that's it. After that is set up, every new customer should start sending a webhook to that particular Appsmith workflow. So I'm going to go back to the customer section now, and we will add a new customer. And we'll just do test. I did several tests before this one, so I'm just going to do test 6. I think that's where I left off. All right, now I'm going to just pull this up before we send it so we can look at the before and after here. If you look at the run history, you can see that there are there's nothing in the run history because all we did was test it from within the editor. It hasn't actually been triggered externally since we published it. So I'm going to refresh just to double check that. And again, the run history is empty. All right, so we will save this new customer. And then back here, refresh this run history. All right, now you can see that the workflow was successfully triggered. It finished without an error, but it did log that there's no customer ID. So the data coming in was received, but the thing that we logged was just that there's no ID. It did send some data, but we're not seeing it because it didn't see a property name called customer ID at the very top level of that object. Now, what I want to do is log the data. So I'm going to say if there's no data, then do that. Otherwise, you can keep going to log the data. All right, so the first time I was looking for .customer ID directly at that top level, it didn't find it. So I'm just going to deploy this again. Let's send one more test. And now what you're going to see is the actual shape of that data coming in. Let's refresh this to get that new run. And now you see 2 entries in the run history here. And this time we did log the data. Now that customer ID I was looking for, here's why we didn't see it. This, I I guess Stripe's webhook in the entire system, it sends everything as an event. Well, it's an object with the type of event. And then it has a .data property, which is another object. And that object's type is customer. So at this level, now we have an ID. You've got the customer's email, so we can get the name and stuff that we need. Everything's at this level, but it is going to be the incoming data dot data. So there's two datas. Every workflow is going to have that dot data, just like every API and query. And then in this case, the particular source is sending it with another property called data. So it's a little redundant, but the value that we want is that data.data.object, and then that would be the customer. So let's say if there's no data.data.object, and just in case we don't want to get a error and have that come back as undefined, because then it wouldn't exit gracefully and finish successfully with a log of no customer ID. Without those question marks there for optional chaining, it might actually just error out and then we don't even get the log. So we will deploy that once more, add another. All right, and now in this most recent one here, the thing that we are logging, we logged the entire .data again. I should have drilled down and only logged the data.data.object. But as you can see, this time it logged the data itself instead of no customer ID. So it made it to this branch where we can write our custom logic. Okay, now that we have a place to write that logic, we can send it off to HubSpot and transform the data and actually create a new contact. So the next thing I'm going to do, we'll go over to HubSpot. We're going to need an API key. Let's see, where did I find this? Integrations. We want to make a private app. And so from here, you create a new private app. Just give it a name and then go on to these scopes. And you'll want to select, let's see, contact. So there's several scopes involved with contacts. At a minimum, you're going to need the contacts.write. You might also want to get the schema. This will let you see like what the values are for a particular field, if it's got a drop down. So select at least that option there for contacts.write. I already have a data source set up, so I'm just going to use mine. But once you do that, you'll get a value, a bearer token that you can use. So then from there, you go to data. You want to create a new data source and choose HubSpot. And then just give it a name, choose bearer token, and paste in your token. So I've already got my data source set up, but that's where you can get your bearer token. Just create a new private app, give it a name, choose that scope, and it will give you a bearer token. So once you have that data source saved, then you can add a new query for that data source. So I'm going to add one to my HubSpot data source here. And the type of query then, get this stuff out of the way, we want to create a customer, which is in the CRM. We have a lot of different options here for the HubSpot API. We are trying to create an object in the CRM. And that object type is contacts. All right, and then you have the properties of that particular object that you're trying to create. And we can check out the HubSpot docs for that, or we can just look at the schema of one when we get it back. So I'm going to call this one create contact. And then just to look at the data, I'm going to add one more. We don't actually need this for our use case, but I want to see basically the schema, the shape of a contact object. So back to the CRM section here, we're going to list objects this time from the contacts. Run this. Okay, now an individual contact object it has email and then first name and last name as separate fields, no underscore. So I'm just going to copy this object here and put that in the body to create a new one. Okay, and we will wrap this whole thing with double curly braces so that we can pass in values dynamically. I am not going to need the created date. That'll happen automatically. And let's see, the object ID that will get added when it's created. Same with the modification. So all we really need then is we're going to add the first and last name and the email. And that data is going to come in from a parameter. So I'm going to run this function passing in some parameters. Let's pause there on this part. I want to go back to our code here. So at this point, I want to run a function using this data and pass it in and make a new contact in HubSpot. So let's see. I'm going to define const customer equals, and then we'll say that is data.data.object, because we already saw that's the path here that it's coming from. Once we have that customer, then we want to run the API for creating a contact. And I'm going to await that. Let's see. Yep, this is an async function, so we can use await, and we'll await running create contact, and then pass in that customer object. So because this is a single object and I want to send it as multiple parameters, I'm just going to use the spread operator on the customer variable, and then that will unpack it and give it X number of properties that get sent in as individual parameters. Now, once that is run with those parameters, we need to use them in the query. So back here, we'll say that the email is coming from this.params.email, and then that data coming from Stripe. Let's take a look at this again. So there's email, and then there's just name. So it's not giving us a first and last name, it's just name. And in these first few tests, I didn't put a space. But what I'm going to do is assume that there is a first and last name. If there's a space, then we'll take that second chunk of text and make it the last name. So we will go back here to the query, the body of this, and for the first name, we use this dot params dot name, because in Stripe it's just name. But then we want to split that. So we'll use the split text method and split it by a space, and then take the first value, because that should return an array. Because there's no param at this point, we're just editing a function and we're not actually passing anything in. I have to use a little optional chaining here to avoid some errors. All right. And then we will do the same thing for the last name. Only this time it is the first index or the second value in the zero-based array there. So that should update the last name with whatever text comes after the space. And with that, I think we are just about there. This should create the contact if we pass in that data. So I'm going to go ahead and deploy this. And we'll check the run history. So we've got 3 in here so far. And up to this point, all we've done is trigger the workflow, but it wasn't doing anything with that data yet other than the console.log. So none of those contacts were sent over to HubSpot. But this one should. I think we're there. It's ready. So I'm going to create one more. We are on test 9 now. I'll do that for the customer's name. All right, moment of truth here. Let's just double check and get back to HubSpot's customers. So we're looking for the CRM contacts rather. All right, so here's our tests, and we have up to 8. Now we're going to save number 9 here from Stripe. And instead of checking the workflow, let's just look right here and see if it made it over to HubSpot. There it is. I just saw test 9 and it disappeared after it loaded. What's going on there? Something weird with the search, maybe cached results or something, but it did go through. Okay, so there's test 9. And if we refresh here, we can see our successful workflow. So here's the one where it actually created the contact, and you see the values that were sent, the parameters that were used in that API, and then it executed, and it finished the execution successfully. So pretty easy to set up, really easy to just transform that data on the fly and set this to where all of the new customers created in Stripe, they'll all get sent, transforming the data to the proper fields and create a contact in HubSpot. So I think that's everything I wanted to show for this week. This one was pretty easy. It's our first look at workflows during the Friday Tech workshops. So I hope you enjoyed this one. If you've got any questions or ideas for future workshops, feel free to drop a comment below. So thanks again for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you next week.